And we are back with another episode of the top 90 albums of the 90s, episode 4, in fact, where we will be counting down numbers 60 to 51. So excited with my friend Nathaniel Ahart here. Hello again, my good friend.
Hello, hello. I'm glad to be back and an episode. I think we're starting to get in a lot of the great stuff coming up here. So I'm really excited to talk about a lot of these choices that made this list.
Yeah, we're getting there, man. So yeah, let's not waste any time at number 60.
Ray of Light by Madonna from 1998. Yet again, another album that I almost can't believe is this low on the list. I think that this is without question Madonna's best record of her entire career. Not only is it her most introspective with songs like Drowned World, Substitute for Love, where she's talking about the effects of fame on her personal life, or, of course, the title track, Ray of Light, which was definitely, she was getting a lot more into, I think it was Buddhism at the time, and she had a lot of time to meditate, and also she became a mother, so that really shaped her entire perspective. And I think that this is really a pop record that I think is so mature for its time, and also so revolutionary, because what Madonna did with this album cannot be taken for granted. Basically bringing electronic music to the mainstream, and some of the best electronic production I've ever heard this side of Daft Punk. I mean, especially on that title track, but so many great songs on here. Sky Fits Heaven, of course, the Shanti Ashtanagi, I hope I pronounced that right. Very, very spiritual, but the way she combines these, like Eastern sounds with electronic music. I mean, there's nothing like it that I have heard before, and maybe even since. Frozen was obviously such a huge hit. Not my favorite song, but I do love it. I mean, I love almost every song on this album. But really, some of her most personal songs are kept off till the end, like To Have and Not to Hold. Little Star, which I think is one of the most beautiful songs a parent has ever written to their child. And of course, Mere Girl, which is my personal favorite song on this album, closing out this thing, which is probably the darkest song that Madonna has ever written, and I think lyrically one of her most absolutely brilliant. Only thing I could say about this album is I think sometimes the production gets samey, but I think from top to bottom, these songs are just incredible. I this was in my top 10. I absolutely think this album should be even higher on the list, but I think it is one of the most significant records from the 90s. So I'm kind of saying like this is why it should be higher, but really glad it made the list nonetheless. I think that this really was an artist at their absolute apex, reinventing themselves once again, maybe for the last time, because I think most people could agree or say that this is her best record. So yeah, absolutely ecstatic to see it on the list.
Yeah, really solid album. And, I don't know, because there were a lot of different artists around that time that were already experimenting with electronic music. But as you said, in the pop vein, I think she
Yeah.
was the one to really make it truly accessible in that way. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing is really good. I can't really argue you saying that's her best album, and that's saying something, as we've talked about Madonna through the 80s. And another, probably my favorite song you didn't even mention, The Power of Goodbye, I think is a
Yeah.
really strong ballad. I love the chord progression on there, and really good songwriting. And yeah, as you said, like Madonna's some of her most personal songs on here. And yeah, once again, reinventing herself. You pretty much said it all, man. And yeah, I guess it could have been higher on the list, but glad to see it on here nonetheless. Good pick, guys.
Yeah, and I just think that this really cemented Madonna, I think, is one of the most legendary pop artists of all time. I would say she's the queen of pop. I mean, there might be a few more like, quote unquote female artists that I like a little bit more. But Madonna, I mean, it's hard to argue that there are many better than her. And yeah, just one of the most impactful artists of all time, and one of my favorites as well.
I see that. Yes.
Yeah.
So now moving on to number 59.
Exile in Guyville by Liz Phair from 1993. Now, this was an album I know gets so much acclaim. A lot of people say it's not just one of the best albums from the 90s, but one of the greatest albums of all time. So I tried to squeeze it in before my list, couldn't get to it. But I just listened to it a few days ago, and my goodness, I can see why this album's so influential. And the way I like to describe it, I think it's like an alt rock feminist version of something like the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan mixed with the Stooges and Prince. Because
Interesting. Yeah, I could
yeah,
kind of
well,
see that.
yeah, I mean, especially on songs like, like Mesmerizing, where you hear those like bells, it like harkens back to, I Want to Be Your Dog. And just
Sure.
the sexuality like almost gives Prince a run for its money. But I think the stripped back nature of these songs, because this is a very lo-fi album, and I think sometime to the album's benefit, and sometime to its detriment, because I think sometimes you hear how it is a little out of tune here and there. But I think there's so many hard driving riffs on this thing, just these really, really punchy alt rock feminist anthems on here, like Never Said, which is the big hit on here, which it just has such a great melody and a great hook. I think one of the standouts for sure. But my favorites are probably Fucking Run and Divorce Song. I think she really dives into some deep topics, especially Fucking Run, I think is one of the most self-critical and heartbreaking songs on the entire album, where she's like saying, "Oh, I guess I'll wait another real." She's trying to look for something real. She
Hmm.
wants, those things that she wants a boyfriend, but she, the what does she want? Cards and sodas or something like that. But just really, really heartbreaking song, but so catchy, so immediate. And of course, Divorce Song has some of the most damning lyrics on the entire album about the emotional disconnect between this couple. But I also absolutely love the vocal harmonies on this album, especially on the songs Flower and Johnny Sunshine. Flower might even be my favorite. That's the song that I really think goes like way beyond almost anything Prince would do in regards to how sensual and just explicit it is. But it is a striking song. You don't forget it.
Hmm.
Johnny Sunshine, once again, I think musically the most ambitious song on this entire album, the moving segments and whatnot. I just think the messages on here, I really love what she was going for, especially in a male dominated scene in the alt rock community. I just think that she stood out, and also I just have to mention how influential this is, because without her we wouldn't have gotten that troop of female singer songwriters that came after her, like Sheryl Crow or Fiona Apple, and perhaps another artist who has an album that I think is even better and more influential, but we'll talk about that later down the list. I just think for its time, this is so revolutionary. Not the best album of the 90s. I think if it made my list, it probably would be around here, maybe a few spots lower, but I mean, I can't argue with this being on the list. It's a very, solid from top to bottom, besides, some of the kind of inconsistencies in regards to the quality of the recording. But yeah, it's an incredibly influential album.
Yeah, and I can see why it is influential for all the reasons that you said. Interesting too that you compared it to the Stooges, because like I didn't think
Mhm.
of it in that way, but that totally makes sense, as a lot of this has just kind of that garage lo-fi kind of vibe to it, which wasn't what I was expecting going into it. Like
Yeah, me
I didn't
neither.
know what to expect, honestly, but so I did enjoy it in bits and pieces. Flower I really enjoyed as well. The harmonies on that song, but
Same.
as you mentioned, like there are some songs where I don't even know if it's out of tune, but like her voice just didn't really
Yeah.
connect with me, and I also couldn't relate to some of the songs, of course. But I mean, there are other female artists who we may discuss in this very episode that it doesn't matter what they're singing about, somehow they just pull me in. And Liz Phair was just not quite that for me, but I totally get why this was once again influential, and also people herald it as much as they do. I mean, some really heavy topics on here, and the way that she came at it, I mean, not many female artists were doing that at that time. So,
No, and I think too, like I also agree. She's not like the greatest singer or anything. And I
Yeah.
also don't think that this is like one of the greatest albums of all time. I think it's very influential, but it doesn't quite hit the mark for me. But I can't blame anybody for loving this because I almost did.
Yeah.
So yeah, really great choice on here.
Yeah, good pick, guys. So that will bring us now to number 58.
The Black Album by Prince from 1994. Prince, obviously the best artist from the 80s who topped the top 80 albums of the 80s, is back once again with, from what I've heard, his best album from the 90s, which wasn't even recorded in the 90s. And we must tell this story for those of who don't know, because this is one of the craziest stories behind any album that ever exists. And how basically this was his follow-up to Sign of the Times, which obviously is my favorite Prince album, and I think him at his absolute peak of his powers. So obviously the production you knew was going to be incredible, all this stuff, and made some of the craziest songs that he's ever laid down. But obviously this album was in response to some critics, who specifically Nelson George, who was saying he lost track of his black audience. So he was trying to like recapture this with this thing that I dub abstract funk. I don't think that there's any album that sounds like this, and it basically created a blueprint for so many interesting albums in that vein to come after. But after he went to this party where he played it, he was high on ecstasy, and as you know, it sounds very Prince like. And then he had like this, I guess he had an epiphany and was convinced it was evil, and he called it called an entity called Spooky Electric, which I guess was the demonic low alter ego that was kind of like Camille on this album, which of course you hear on the song Bob George, which was an attack at Nelson George and Bob Cavallo, the manager, which is one of the craziest Prince songs of all time. And I absolutely love how off kilter it is. And just this, this really hyper emasculated guy who's like saying to his girl, "I'm going to slap you in the next week." I mean, it's terrible what's going on, but just that statement, it's so funny to me because it's like, who thinks of this stuff? And then he's like, there's all these interludes where there's a shootout, and then like he wails this guitar solo, and it just, of course, that famous line of "Who's Prince, that skinny motherfucker with the high voice?" So funny how self-aware he's being on this. But the thing was, he really felt this was evil because he was attacking a lot of people. Like Cindy C is about. He saw Cindy Crawford at like I think a club in Paris. She didn't want to have sex with him, so he got mad about it, and he wrote a song about it. And then of course Dead on It, which I think is really funny, but I don't really appreciate the sentiment of, he was kind of seemingly anti-hip-hop at the time, which obviously he turned his page around, and obviously the new power generation in the 90s. But yeah, man, I mean, of course I think this became so bootleg because right after, when he had that epiphany, he withdrew it, and Warner Brothers had to take it all off. But of course, some of those copies slipped out into the ether, and this was one of the most famous bootlegs this side of Smile and the Basement tapes. So really, this was such a legendary album. And then he was trying to get out of his record contract with Warner Brothers, and then they're like, okay, I guess he just relented, said, "Well, we'll release this for a limited time just to fulfill one more album." And so it was only released for a short period of time, and you can only find it on YouTube, which is still great because we have it, and we have songs like "Le Grind," which is some of the hardest funk that Prince has ever laid down. What a great way to open this album. Amazing song. Of course, Super Funky Califragisexy, which is, he's like talking about eating squirrel meat, and then like I think it's talking about aphrodisiac. I mean, this album's crazy. And of course, Rock Hard in a Funky Place. I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory what's going on there. And of course, my favorite track, which I probably can't say the name of because that wouldn't be a good look. But the instrumental on here, I think, is my favorite song. It goes so hard and so crazy, honestly. And of course, When Two Are in Love, have to mention that song, which was obviously the only song that had ever been pulled off another project and put onto another album, which was Love Sexy, from, I think it was like 1989. So yeah, or 1988, somewhere in that time. But yeah, this really, I understand why he wanted to pull it off, because like if this was the last thing he'd release, like that's what people are going to remember him for. But honestly, the music is so good that I think he should have released it. But hey, we got it in the 90s, at least in some form of fashion, and here it is on the list. I think honestly, this is my second favorite Prince album, even more than Purple Rain. Not because the
Wow.
songs are more iconic, but I just think the production's better, and really just shows how creative he was and how influential he is still to this day. So yeah, I absolutely love this album. And I think it could have even been higher. This is like in my top 15, I think. So yeah,
You make a
glad to
good
see it on the list.
argument for it being that high up as far as Prince's greatest albums, because
Yeah.
I mean, just thinking about, I always forget that it was technically recorded in the 80s, like, and when you think of that this was like sandwiched in between Sign of the Times and the Batman soundtrack, which I also love that. It's just crazy like how this guy was just constant, like,
Same.
so, and putting out great stuff. I mean, there were some killer grooves on this thing, and I did not know of its existence until you told me about it. So I appreciate you, get me into it. And it's one of those that I think will grow on me more as I listen to it more. But for now, I don't know that I would rank it that high as far as my Prince rankings, but I definitely appreciate it, especially for what it is. I mean, this just a gift that came out of nowhere for a lot of people. So
Yeah. And it just shows just how much of an absolute musical genius he was, because no,
yeah,
but and this is why I definitely always put him above Michael Jackson, because like Michael Jackson wasn't doing anything this crazy, you know what I mean?
yeah, not
But
as prolific either. So
no, well,
you know,
that's always the argument, but gotta go with Prince, I think.
sure. Well, yeah, great pick, guys. So now that brings us to number 57.
What's up? It's Tupac. Can you get away? Let me come swoop you up.
Me Against the World by none other than Tupac Shakur from 1995. And this, I think, is Tupac's best album. Obviously, people gravitate towards something like All Eyes on Me, but I think that this is really the one where his hard-hitting messages, his poetry, his messages about black empowerment, and also all these other issues that are plaguing the black community, which in some ways also plagued him, tragically enough. But yeah, I think this really just shows how much of a genius he was, especially on songs like obviously the title track, So Many Tears, yet again, is such a powerful song. His storytelling is just at the top of its game on this album more than any other album in his entire discography, I would argue 100%. Of course, we have to talk about obviously the biggest track on here, which is Dear Mama, which is just such a vulnerable tribute and story about his mama and everything that she went through with her drug addiction and just how he almost resented her at times. I mean, it really is such a beautiful and vulnerable song, to the point that Kendrick Lamar heard that and he said that was like the song that made him want to do rap, because hearing someone be this way on such a otherwise hard-edged record was really something that affected a lot of people. Nobody had done anything like this at the time. But my favorite song is personally Can You Get Away, where yet again he's getting into some hard hitting issues like physical, like domestic abuse. This guy is beating on his woman, but her and Tupac have this connection. He calls him, "Hey, it's Tupac," and he's like trying to get her away from this guy, and just such a beautiful hook. The synthesizers on here are just they just shimmer with ease despite the tension of the situation spiraling out of control. I just absolutely love the depths that he goes to on this album, and I just think, as I said, from top to bottom, I mean, this really made Tupac a legend, and I'm really glad to see it on the list, even though I think it could be a little higher.
Yeah, it's a good pick. Tupac. What can you say? I mean, one of the greatest in the game, and for me personally, I am one of those that does like All Eyes on Me a bit more than this album, and I think that's mainly because I mean the subject matter is so like relentlessly serious on this one. All Eyes on Me, I think, is a bit more friendly and fun, and shows his sense of humor a little bit more. Whereas a lot of the songs on here are mostly about you know being strapped and having just so much gun violence. It's like, oh, okay. But I get it in the
But
time
that's
frame
life,
that it
man.
came out, yeah, and where he came from. So I mean, um For me, yeah, Dear Mama is probably the standout. I also enjoy Fuck the World. I think that's a really good song, which I didn't realize until recently that Shock G produced, which makes sense since I love Digital Underground. So, um, and I believe he came up with those guys. So, um, but yeah, good pick. I probably, would have it around this level, although you say it should be higher. I mean,
Probably in the 30s, I would say. Yeah.
wow, okay, that
I
much
love
higher.
it, man. It was definitely higher up on my list for sure.
Yeah, well, didn't quite make mine, but we may hear more from Mr. Pac in the future, so we'll see. So now at number 56. The Battle of Los Angeles by Rage Against the Machine from 1999, their third album, and in my opinion, their best. I think just out of the gate, man, the 1-2 punch of Testify and Guerrilla Radio, just some of the best riffs that they've had on any song, and just the four of them musically, they're just so tight. I mean, the rhythm section of Tim Comerford and Brad Wilk, just incredible. And then Zach De La Rocha, just, oh my God, incredible vocally throughout this album. And, of course, you got to give it up for the guitar master of Tom Morello, just throughout. I mean, the way that he makes his guitar sound like he's a DJ on certain songs, it's like unreal. But yeah, the whole first half of this album, Calm Like a Bomb, Mic Check, Sleep Now in the Fire, all incredible. The second half does fall off a little bit, although there are some gems on here like Born of a Broken Man and Voice of the Voiceless. New Millennium Homes, I think, has one of the tightest grooves throughout this album. And that's the thing, man. It's like they bring elements of funk and into rock and hip hop in such a brilliant way that there's really no one else that sounds like these guys. And it's great to know that they're back out there at least performing again together. Hopefully we'll get new music in the future, but man, what a way to go out. This is just in my opinion, once again, their best album, which is really saying something because they had a good 3 album run there. And yeah, great pick.
Yeah, most people would say that this is their last album, even though they had a covers one. But this,
Well, yeah, that's true.
yeah, most people would say this is the last true Rage Against the Machine album, and I'd probably have to agree. I mean, just Testify and Guerrilla Radio. I mean, Guerrilla Radio is just so awesome. I think one of their best songs, probably my favorite on here. But there's a lot of other standouts. I mean, you basically said it all. But I will argue, I actually think that this is my least favorite Rage Against the Machine. It still made my list. I think it should be a little bit down on the list. I just think at this point, after hearing their debut and Evil Empire, which I think is better. I mean, Bulls on Parade alone. I just think that it's my one problem with Rage Against the Machine. I think they're a great band. I don't quite love them because I think they sound very samey after a while. And I think at this point, you just kind of, I mean, I think he's one of the best guitarists ever. I just kind of get a little sick of everything Tom Morello's doing because I'm just like, okay, like I've heard this done in so many different ways already on the songs that you've made. But that's the thing. I mean, it's a really, really good album from top to bottom, regardless of what I'm saying. I mean, just like in the 90s, just one quality album after the next. And this is my least favorite. I do have to say, just because I think that some of the things that they were hitting at on their other albums, I think were either or immediate or just more impactful. But hey, this is definitely deserves to be on the list. I will say that, even though I'd put it just a little bit lower.
Yeah, and I can see how you can say that about them being samey. I guess for me personally, this was the album that I was introduced to them with, so I kind of went backwards in that order. So so maybe that's part of it, but yeah, I mean, Evil Empire was also great, and of course their debut. So we'll see. We may be talking about them again on the list, but yeah, can't complain, guys. This was a great pick once again. So now that brings us to number 55. Midnight Marauders by A Tribe Called Quest. Yes, so glad to see these guys on the list. This could have been a little bit higher, honestly. I mean, gotta love Q-Tip, Fife Dog, and Ali Shaheed Muhammad, the DJ. Just amazing production on songs like Award Tour, Electric Relaxation, Oh My God, which features Busta Rhymes, who already had been featured on the album prior. These guys just, I mean, they were always collaborating with so many different artists out of the New York hip hop scene, which for me, this was like my favorite of all the hip hop scenes, early 90s New York City. And these guys were the best of the best. I mean, Q-Tip alone is amazing, but then Fife, you can't count him out either. I mean, they're just both incredible how they go back and forth throughout the album, and yeah, absolutely love it. It's not my favorite, but we may get to that one as well, hopefully. And yeah, so glad to see this.
Oh my goodness, I agree with you 100% that this should absolutely be a lot higher. I think this album's absolutely incredible. One of the best hip hop albums from the 90s. Of course, with songs like Steve Biko, Stir It Up, which is great. Of course, Award Tour with that hook from Trugoy from De La Soul. We on Award Tour with Muhammad Man, coming at you every place with the mic in my hand. It's just, oh my goodness. And then, of course, Pipe Dog coming in with some of his best bars you've ever heard, especially, Lyrics Anonymous, You Never Hear Me copies. So real. And of course, my track record's longer than a DC-20 aircraft. Man, it just gets me going. And dude, like just a little
awesome
blemishes they put on, like when Q-Tip's going, do that, do that, do that, and he's like, and you hear the girls go, okay, do that, do that, do that, and it's just, it's such a fun song, and just the production on it from Ali Shaheed Muhammad is just so good. Coming out with the Sugar Cuts once again. One of my favorites is my favorite track is obviously, when they're talking about, when Q-Tip's talking about the origin of the N-word, and of course they say rolling out of the dome of the white man's mouth, and you just get the history of like how other people, as he said, other people in the community think it's crummy, but he doesn't, and his lips are like an ooh-wop as he starts to spray. I mean, it's just such a great song, the way they break down these ideas, and just the storytelling on here, I think, is even better than Low End Theory in that sense, especially I think songs like Midnight, where he's like telling this, the story of this crazy night out. And I just love the segues between the tracks with the computer voice that sounds like this. And I just think, despite the fact like it's just really interesting, there's some really, really profound stuff, like like there's one, I think it's where she's like saying basically, just because you don't have to be a man to pull the trigger, but just because you pull the trigger doesn't necessarily, something along those lines. It's like really, really thought-provoking stuff that just kind of food for thoughts. But as you said, Electric Relaxation is one of the smoothest cuts the Tribe ever laid on record. I mean, Clap Your Hands is so much fun. Yeah, I mean, this album is just awesome from top to bottom. I think it's just as good as Low End Theory, and that's another reason why I think it should absolutely be higher on the list. But glad to see them on here. You can't go wrong with these guys. Maybe the best hip-hop group of all time.
Yeah, that's hard to argue there, man. And yeah, in this case, we maraud for ears.
Yes, most music is listened to at night.
Yeah, so great, man.
Oh, good, man.
Gotta love it. So great pick, guys. So now at number 54. Enema by Tool from 1996. Their second album, and many would say their strongest, opening up with Stinkfist, and you got songs like Hooker with a Penis, some really interesting titles of songs here, even though you don't always understand exactly what Maynard Keenan is singing about. But I gotta say, he has an impressive vocal range. I really like the tone of his voice, even though I can't always understand him. The title track Enema specifically, I think, is the highlight of the album. That's the one that starts with this kind of breathing sound and ends with him yelling, "Learn to swim," which I believe the song happens to be about, like California drifting into the ocean and all this kind of crazy stuff. But yeah, I mean, the band is super talented. I mean, especially the bass playing throughout the record is really incredible and kind of singular to their overall sound. I'm not that crazy about the guitar tones that they use, but and I do think that the album is a bit long for my liking for this kind of style, especially. And if I had it my way, I would have rather had Deftones show up, or at least them have also made the list, because out of the new metal category, I kind of prefer Deftones over Tool. But I know that there's a lot of diehard Tool fans that are probably happy that this made it, so can't fault them.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the worst episode, or not the worst episode, the worst album on this episode, but it's still good. I think I really love the sound of Tool. I actually love I think I forgot Adam, I forgot his name, but his guitar tones are I think incredible. I think that's what makes them stand out.
Adam
Adam
Jones,
Jones,
yeah.
Adam Jones. Yeah, yeah. I love his guitar work because there isn't a band that, at least that I've heard, that quite sounds like Tool. And I just think the sound effects, especially on the song Eulogy, I can't understand anything Maynard Keenan is saying, but that song particularly, I just love the sonics of it. It's so immediate, it's so thrashing, it goes so hard. I absolutely love that one, and I think the title track is the standout. And I can understand everything he's saying, but that's the biggest problem. One, I don't know what he's saying half the time, and I like the tone of his voice, but I think it goes, like he loses pitch and then he just gets drowned in the mix. And I'm like, why? Like, I want to hear what you're saying, man. Especially with an album this long, I just think it's very inconsistent. Like the best stuff on here is obviously really incredible, and then you have some really interesting stuff like Cicero, Some Ability, which is just this really blown out sound effect of like this baby crying. I really love the sound collages on here. I think are so I guess boundary pushing, especially the last track, Third Eye, which I do think goes on for a little bit too long, but I think the others stand out on this album musically, and just it's such a journey listening to it. And I think that is why I like this album as much as I do. I wouldn't have put it on my list, to be quite honest with you, but it's definitely a quality record. I just don't think it should be higher than any of the ones that we've discussed in this episode. If this showed up in the last or the first couple episodes, I'd be like, okay, but I don't think it should be this high. I'm not super into Tool in that way, and I just think some of their stuff just wanders off into absolute pretentiousness, especially on their first album, where one of the songs was literally cricket noises for 7 minutes, and I'm like, I have so much better stuff I could be doing right now. But I do appreciate what they're going for, and I definitely recognize this as a quality record.
Yeah, yeah, and like I said, I mean, they do have a sound all of their own. No one really sounds like Tool, even within the metal or new metal genre. But not as much my cup of tea. But I get it why a lot of people love them. I mean, they're good at what they do, and this definitely is one of their better outings. So yeah, not bad, guys. So now at number 53. When the Pawn by Fiona Apple, her second album and the second album of hers to make the list from 1999, produced by John Bryan, which the production on here is just incredible. And all the people that are playing on this record, I don't know all their names offhand, but I believe Matt Chamberlain plays drums, and he is just insanely good. But yeah, this to me is a big step up from Tidal, just all around. Her songwriting, her delivery on these songs. There's really not a weak track on the record, from the opener of On the Bound to the beautiful closing ballad, I Know. Some highlights for me, Paper Bag, I think is one of her best songs of her entire career. Just an amazing ballad that really shows her softer side, because she can get a little angsty on here as well on songs like Limp and Get Gone. But yeah, Fast as You Can is just really shows off her piano playing chops. The Way Things Are is a great track. A Mistake, where she's really, I feel like she gets so naked on this album, like where she's really just showing all her inadequacies for the world to see, and in a way that is just really beautiful. And I don't think she ever actually topped this album, although many would disagree with me on that. I think this was her peak, where just this was actually in my top 20. I just think it's a masterful record. And to think that she was, I guess at this point, what, maybe 22 years old, I mean, just insane, the level of talent. And absolutely love it. So glad it made the list.
Yeah, I had this on my list for sure. It's definitely her best album from the 90s. I wouldn't argue it being on the list, but unlike you having in your top 20, I had it probably more near the 70 range. I think that's where I would put it, because this is the thing. I mean, she definitely expands a lot musically on here. Just the jazzy influences all over this album. The playing, it's very, it feels very improvisational with all the instruments that she's bringing in, expanding her musical palette. Of course, Paper Bag is as you said, one of her best songs. Fast as You Can, she kind of beat Kanye to that one, and now people are realizing with Kanye, run away as fast as you can. But also, I Know, yeah, as you said, it's just such a beautiful song. I think my biggest problem with this album, though, because I really like it, as you said, not a weak song, but I just think the arrangements are pretty basic. I don't think that all the melodies really stand out at all. It just sounds very like standard singer-songwriter, and maybe that was what Fiona Apple started. I just don't think it sounds amazing 100% of the time. I just don't think it really comes off as musically interesting as some of her contemporaries. But hey, I mean, I'm excited to keep going through her discography, because this was a really good album nonetheless, and I do think it deserves to be on the list for sure. I just probably would put it a little bit lower, and I certainly don't like it more than Liz Phair's album, just by a little bit, and I certainly don't think either one's better than Ray of Light. So I'll just throw that out there.
Well, yeah, and I know what you're saying as far as the musical arrangements go, but I think that she went into this album, if I remember reading correctly, she kind of like with nothing written in advance, very much like and she wanted to be led almost more by the percussion than any other instrument. So when you hear it, knowing that, you kind of get the sense of like, oh, I can see why there's like multiple drum solos on the album and things like that. Like, and sometimes the percussion is almost like one of the main instruments. And that's why I think Matt Chamberlain, I had to just shout him out, because he does such an amazing job throughout the album, and possibly could have been credited for some of the songwriting if that's the case. So, but yeah, I mean, as I said, one of my faves, should have been higher, but we can argue
I'm okay
that.
with it being here,
Yeah, whatever. All right. Well, now at number 52. All Eyes on Me by Tupac. He came again, and this makes me happy that this one's a little bit higher than the other one. But yeah, as I was saying before, I find this album to be a bit more fun overall. It is maybe a bit too long, being a double album, but man, where it hits, man, I mean, mostly on the first half. Songs like Scandalous, which features Nate Dogg, You got a lot of really cool features on here, like Method Man shows up on Got My Mind Made Up. You've got Snoop Dogg on Two of America's Most Wanted. That's a really fun jam. How Do You Want It, I think, is a huge highlight on here with Casey and JoJo offering their great vocals. And but then you also have some of the, the serious stuff like Only God Can Judge Me. But then, of course, California Love with Dr. Dre and just his great production on that track. I mean, that's you got to love it with that classic taken from that California knows how
Roger
to party.
Troutman.
Roger Troutman, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a classic. But yeah, I mean, it does, especially on the second half, go on a bit long. And even though there's a few gems there as well, but I think as far as Tupac goes, this is just another notch in his belt, man. A great pick.
Yeah, I mean, I had this on my list, but I I disagree that, this is better than, as I was saying, than Me Against the World, because this is the thing. I mean, I love, like music that's fun or whatever, but when it comes to gangster rap, I'm just, after a certain point, like, I don't want to keep hearing about like drugs and money and sex. Like, I like when Tupac's actually talking about something that's like real and something serious, because I feel like that's what truly makes him a voice of his generation, so to speak. But
Yeah.
as you said, the first side on this album is awesome overall. I think it really drops off in the second half, but the songs you said, I Only God Can Judge Me is really yet again one of his most profound songs, and of course I think without question California Love is the best song on this album. Just that California Love, I mean,
Yeah.
everyone knows it. It's so anthemic. One of his absolute best and probably his most iconic song, if you really had to pin it down. No More Pain yet again is another one. Like, that's the thing, man. I think that this is a really fun album, but it's so inconsistent and so front loaded, except What's Your Phone Number, which is, I think, maybe Tupac's worst song. It's pretty bad and it's very embarrassing that it's even on this album. And just the way he almost like predicts his own death on this, because this came out right before he died. This is the last album he released in his lifetime, and just so sad to kind of see that come to fruition, and especially in the way that it happened. Kind of senseless. And this is definitely a classic album. I don't think it should be this high yet again. I even had this a little bit lower than When the Pawn, so I would probably have this around the 70s area. But it still deserves to be on the list. It's obviously a classic. Just a little bit too high, I think, but that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Tupac. I love Tupac, so
That's interesting how you were saying like you felt like it's too excessive. We're talking about the drugs and the partying aspect, which I felt the other album was excessive in the other respect. It's almost like if you took the best of those two albums and just made one, where it wasn't excessive in either direction. It might just be the perfect Tupac greatest hits or something. But
it could be. But yeah, the length I think really hampers this thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Because like if it were just the first side, I think it would be his best album, because obviously it has the best production on any Tupac album. Of course, that has a lot to do with Dr. Dre, but
and George Clinton even shows up on a track again. So he's shown up twice on the list now via other hip hop artists.
Right.
So that makes me happy.
Yeah.
But I did want to say before we get to number 51, I've been trying to air my grievances of missing albums as we go. And I noticed we talked about a few albums from 1999 on this episode. And one album that did not make the list from that year is The Man Who by Travis. And I think that's an amazing album. And somehow that did not make our list. And I'm like, how is that possible? But whatever. So now
listen to it. So
okay, well maybe
that could be it.
That could be the reason. So all right, now at number 51.
Reasonable Doubt by Jay-Z from 1996. Now, a lot of people would also consider this not just one of the best albums from the 90s, not just one of the greatest hip hop albums of all time, but one of the greatest albums of all time. I don't quite feel that way, but this was certainly on my list. I mean, what a strong debut from Jay-Z. Obviously, you know, so many great tracks on here. Brooklyn's Finest with, of course, the most famous or notorious B.I.G., if you will. Dead Presidents 2 obviously was a standout. I think Jay-Z really shows his capacity though for storytelling on you know, songs like The Evils, where he just really tells these hard-hitting street tales of violence and betrayal. I just think that song is so powerful. And of course, the famous song with Foxy Brown that was such a hit. Obviously, you know, it's a party classic. Yeah, you gotta love it. And yeah, I think you know, here and there, even though, you know, Jay-Z's talking about the hustler lifestyle that he came up in, you really definitely get a lot of, you know, very intellectual and thought-provoking statements on this album that I think really come to form here and there. I don't think it's the most mind-blowing hip-hop album of all time, but it really shows just how, I mean, Jay-Z is one of the greatest rappers of all time, whether you like the man or not. Just his success story coming from there to where he is now is just beyond impressive. I think one of the best stories, if you will, in that sense. And yeah, it all started here, and yeah, I would have put it lower on the list, honestly, maybe in the last episode or something, but gotta have this album on the 90s list. It just wouldn't feel right to leave it off, and yeah, I'm really glad to see it here.
Yeah, I would have had it lower as well, but really great to see him represented and really strong for a debut album. I mean, you can't knock the hustle, you know. And
Yeah.
Brooklyn's Finest, I think, is the standout for me. I love Notorious B.I.G., so it was great to have him on there as well. But yeah, I mean, as far as his 90s output, this probably would be the best. And he would go on to do, I think, better things in the new millennium.
I agree.
But yeah, great to see hip hop being so well represented on this episode. It's like
Yeah.
4 out of the 10 on this one, so
Damn.
pretty wild, man. And that's not going to be the end of it, but yeah, really great picks, guys. This has been a really interesting episode overall, and I think the list just keeps getting more and more just kind of all over the map in a good way. But yeah, a lot of the ones on this episode were not even on my list, so we'll see what happens from here. I think it's just going to continue to get better, but yeah, thanks for all the votes as always, and hopefully you guys are enjoying this as much as we are.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that this episode panned out the way it did. I actually had most of these albums on my list, or I would have if I had heard them beforehand. But so yeah, I think it's coming into form. I think there may be some more disagreements later down the line, and we'll get to that. But yeah,
Sure.
I'm really glad how a lot of this is turning out, and of course, gotta subscribe to Johnny Radio, and of course my channel as well. You know, we've got a lot of great stuff going on. Of
Please
course,
do that.
I announced, thank you. I announced the top 100 greatest films of all time list. So if you haven't seen that, please check out my video announcing it. Definitely going to be a huge blowout after this. And yeah, guys, thank you for tuning into the series as always.
Yeah, can't wait to see you on the next episode, guys. We'll see you there.
Take it
Peace.
easy.
When I was young, me and my mama had beef, 17 years old, kicked out on the streets. Though back at the time